Hi folks, Matt Easton here with Mark Gilbert. So I'm talking to Mark about all sorts of, we've already been talking for hours and hours and we couldn't film the whole thing, but we wanted to film some things because Mark is, as far as I'm concerned, a well of useful information, particularly on the subject of tournament fighting. Mark's been coming to fight camp for 11 years, I think, and I'm fairly confident in saying that he, in terms of tournament performance, he has far outperformed everybody else who's been to fight camp in terms of number of fights fought, percentage of fights won, and numbers of medals won. I think Mark's way up there. There are 2 or 3 other people who've done very well, and there's lots of other people who are very good fighters, but in terms of just raw statistics and consistent performance, Mark is very, very notable. Mark doesn't in general get to many HEMA events, but is an annual regular at fight camp. So if you want to fight him, come to fight camp or contact him. But I thought it'd be really useful for those of you out there who either compete in HEMA or know Mark, maybe fought against him either in the fighting area in fight camp or indeed in any of the tournaments, or just know about him, have watched Mark fighting in the videos of the tournaments that I put online. I thought it'd be really nice to ask Mark, and in fact I just asked him just before we started rolling the camera, what would be your 3 pieces of advice to someone to improve their tournament performance? So it doesn't matter what level you're at, hopefully you've got room to improve, and maybe there's some things we can talk about that might help you think about some of those things. So initially I was going to ask for 3 points, but it turns out Mark's got more than 3 points, so I'll just let him talk. So, in no particular order of importance, what things come to mind in how to make your tournament performance better?
Okay, so kind of switching the question just slightly to start off with, I think one of the fundamental reasons why I've been as successful as I have been in tournaments is because of the amount of practice and sparring and analysis of myself that I've had over the years. So actually, it's kind of a little bit of an obvious question in some senses, but the more you practice and analyse that and make a progression in your sword fighting, the better you'll be in a tournament in general. So that aside, particular tips for people if they want to become more and more successful in tournaments. One of the fundamental ones is do a lot of tournaments. So if you are really maybe a bit stressed about tournaments or a bit fearful of tournaments, or you feel really uncomfortable in tournaments, that is very, very normal. Most people, me included, when I started off in tournaments, felt uncomfortable, and I was going to talk about some of those kind of physiological things that change in us when we have an uncomfortable situation like a tournament. I'll touch on that a little bit later. But actually, the more you do something, especially if you're a little bit anxious about it, if you face that and repeat it, the better you will be able to be.
And this is standard military doctrine as well, of course. The more that you make soldiers repeat an activity, the more likely they're going to do it under fire. Yeah.
But it really transfers over to anything in life.
Yeah.
The more you do something. Another good example, I think, is public speaking. I didn't used to be that good at public speaking. I'm not saying I'm brilliant now, but what I did,
rubbish.
But what I did was I realised I wasn't particularly good at it. So then I got into a time of when I got an opportunity, for example, in a business meeting or on a training course, I would always find myself volunteering to speak first. And years of kind of doing that meant that I became a lot more comfortable. And if you are more comfortable, then you're able to speak more clearly. It's the anxiety that causes you to be tongue-tied and causes you to feel as if you're getting hot in the face, or to cause you to stutter. The more you do it, the more relaxed you are, the more known situation it is, and you're more likely to be able to being in control of yourself and perform more effectively.
And I think it's very noticeable to me, having, obviously I've competed in a fair number of tournaments myself, but having run a fair number of tournaments, I run most of the tournaments every year at Fight Camp, of course, I see people who I know go into a competitive environment. And many of these people I know, I spar with, I train with on a regular basis, and different people handle it very differently. I mean, I'm sure you're going to talk about the physiological things in a minute, but it's very interesting how some people go within themselves and become less good. They become or not frozen with fear so much as they clam up. They move a little bit slower, they're more hesitant, they're more vulnerable to feints, they're just nervous. The adrenaline gets the better of them. And a few other people, some people just naturally, it seems, rise to the challenge. And there are a couple of my training buddies who, every time I see them fight in a tournament, they fight better than I see in weekly sparring.
Yeah.
Now, speaking personally, I'm not one of those people, unfortunately. I always find that I fight worse under stress than I do in a relaxed environment. I always fight better when I'm relaxed, but you're a little bit different. You, I think, are one of those people who tends to sort of rise to the occasion.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'll stop talking.
One thing I just wanted to make clear to start off with, tournament fighting is not for everybody.
No.
And there are a range of reasons why people don't want to do tournaments, and I think they're very, very valid reasons. However, I do think that for some people, the benefit of going into tournaments and overcoming some of those anxieties, it can then have a really, really big positive effect on them, and maybe will actually flood over into other elements of their life as well, in terms of confidence and self-esteem. It has the potential to make people much more confident. Now, in terms of I'll go into the physiology kind of bit now. My understanding of it, and I'm not a specialist in kind of physiology, but my understanding of it is that when people are under stress, or when they are in what has been described as a fight or flight kind of physical condition, there are changes in the body. One of those changes is that the blood tends to move away from non-essential organs, as in organs that wouldn't be used in a combat situation, and that blood
I know there's going to be lots of filthy comments on this video now.
and that blood tends to move to your arms and your legs and to your brain,
The bits that are useful for fighting.
the bits that are useful for fighting.
Evolution has done this to...
Absolutely, but that can have some other symptoms, if you like. And one of those symptoms, and I'm sure a lot of people have experienced this, is that you can get what some people describe as a butterflies in the stomach. And it's really quite an uncomfortable feeling. And my understanding is that is actually partly due to the blood moving away from the stomach, and possibly due to an increase in the adrenaline in the system. Actually, one of the things that I would say in terms of a tip for tournament fighters is see if you can start to understand what is happening with your body and why your body is doing that. So, for example, when I teach some of my young students, and I teach kind of 8-year-olds and up in sword fighting, when I've done a tournament with them, I start to get them to tell me what they're feeling. And if they're feeling that kind of stomach kind of situation, I can say to them, actually, instead of turning that into a negative thought, think about that as your body preparing for combat. So actually, those feelings are an indicator that your body is going to be more effective in that fight or in that tournament. So actually, it becomes a hopefully becomes a positive thought rather than a negative thought. Because there's a real danger if you start to get anxious about going into a tournament that you start to negative talk yourself. You start to think, oh well, I'm nervous, or I mean, I frequently want to go for a wee before a tournament. And again, my limited understanding of it is that it's the body flushing out kind of unuseful kind of liquids,
excess baggage.
Absolutely. And it's not that I wet myself before combat.
Although clearly that happens with people who are very frightened sometimes, that famously so. So it's part of the same physiological.
Yeah. So again, these kind of physiological feelings are normally there for some sort of reason. So if you understand those and you can turn them into a positive, then you're much less likely to be negatively affected when you go into a tournament situation. As Matt mentioned, there are some extremely talented fighters in HEMA. Some really up-and-coming fighters. The technique is fantastic, their flow is fantastic. Generally, their kind of distance and their timing is great. And some of those fighters, when they get in a tournament, they choke, if you like. They really drastically underperform. And there could be a whole range of factors there, but certainly the physiology may well be negatively influencing them. And I think mentally that their performance is way below where it could be.
I think it's quite stark as well sometimes at fight camp, because we have this contrast between the fighting area, the fighting arena, and the sparring arena, and the tournament area. And sometimes you will see the same people in each environment, and they look completely different when they're fighting. When they're relaxed, they're out with their mates, they're having a laugh. Doesn't matter how many, who wins. They're sparring out there, then they come in here, and they're sometimes like different people in that environment.
There's something about people watching you, and it's 1 versus 1.
It's horrible.
And
I hate it.
There's only a few amount of, certainly in the majority of HEMA type tournaments, it tends to be very low amount of hits that you have to get, a low amount of points that you have to score to get to the next round. Typically, you tend to have either pool fights and then some knockout rounds, but certainly in the majority of the ones at Fight Camp, which is the one that Matt runs, they tend to be a knockout kind of tournament. So if you fail in that one fight, you are out, and you may not be able to compete in Fight Camp in that weapon type for another year. So that again can pile on the pressure, and that can affect someone negatively, because it's this one chance kind of succeed with all your peers watching. You don't want to be a failure, you don't want to underperform, and all of those things can play on your mind and loop round and affect your ability.
I mean, speaking personally, I think the peer pressure is the biggest concern for myself, but also a lot of the people I know from my club, because you know that your club mates are watching, people from other clubs are watching. If you're an instructor, then other instructors are watching. The video is probably going to go on the internet, so the world is watching. And that's... If you start thinking about that, which I think probably most people do think about it at some point during the process, that can be really nerve-wracking. But different people feed off that nerves in different ways, don't they? And you seem to feed off that in a very positive way, like very few people I know.
In general, in the main, I do. So I'm very consistent, but I'm not infallible.
How do you do that?
In terms of my... I think So for example, to pick up on my very first point, doing it a lot. So I have now been in more than 120 tournaments in my career. And I've won quite a considerable portion of those. So that exposure, continual exposure to those situations mean that whenever I go into a new tournament, it isn't a new situation really that I'm needing to be fearful of.
Yeah.
So that's one.
So familiarity.
Familiarity is really, really useful. Another one is in terms of how I kind of perceive my opponent within a tournament and how I perceive my opponent outside of a tournament. So I hope that I'm a friendly, approachable, sociable guy in the kind of real life and when I'm sparring and when I'm chatting to people at events. But when I'm in a tournament, I have a mental shift in terms of how I see my opponent. Now, I almost don't... So some people see the competition and they see their opponent and they think, oh, this is going to be tough. I'm fighting against another competitor, if you like. Some people think, straight away, they're better than me, so I'm probably going to lose. I tend to come into it with I'm very likely to win if I try my hardest, I focus, I hit peak performance as quick as possible, and I'm confident. So I don't mean to sound arrogant on that because I've got an awful lot of experience in the fighting, but I'm really trying to be as positive as I can. So I'm almost, and I've got to be a little bit mindful because I'll tell you why in a second, I'm almost seeing the opponent as my victim in that martial context. And I am going to do everything I can within the structured rule system. I'm absolutely not suggesting that you cheat in those situations, but there is an environment in front of you and you adapt to it and you get the most out of the rule set. I will then fight to my best ability and I will try to, ideally, crush my opponent. So I'm aiming to beat them, say if it's to 5 hits, I'm aiming to beat someone 5 points to 0. I do not want to be hit. However, you need to be careful because, yes, I'm really focused on beating that opponent and almost seeing them as a victim, if you like, but I also understand that it is possible for any fighter at any point in time on any day to beat any other fighter. So I also
that's a very important
have to respect that person, and that's one of the reasons why I try to do my best as quickly as possible to knock them out as quickly as possible so they can't even get into the fight, because I respect every single fighter I fight and understand that whether it's due to luck, whether it's due to them having a really, really good day, it's always possible for any fighter, even a novice, to knock out a better fighter.
That's such a good point, and I have literally come a cropper in at least 2 tournaments I can clearly remember because of underestimating opponents, because I thought, oh, I know them, I know how they fence, I'm going to take this nice and easy, and they surprised me. And I lost points or lost to them because I didn't go in with my A game, essentially.
Yeah.
And conversely, you come up against a really tough opponent, so long as you're feeling up for it, you will sometimes raise your game because you think that person's impossible to beat, and then you'll surprise yourself when you actually do well against them.
So this is the good news for the novice fighters and the less experienced fighters, is that there is always a chance of beating your opponent. If it's a really high system with you're having to achieve lots and lots of hits, then your chances are going down.
And there's always the factor of luck.
But if it's a system where typically at fight camp there have been rounds where it's been to 3 points. Now, anybody is able, with a bit of luck, as long as they're positive and they go for it, to win 3 points in a row against a better fighter.
Yeah.
It is entirely possible, which is why, if you are that better fighter, you need to really maintain that focus and close that opponent down as quickly as possible. So actually, I become a very different person in that mindset in a tournament than I am in, let's say, real life and sparring, because I tend to be really ruthless. Again, within the rule system, but I tend to be really ruthless. And I have And for me, it doesn't matter who I'm fighting against. Whether I'm fighting against a child in my club, whether I'm fighting against an old man, a lady, a man.
They're a competitor.
And they're a competitor. It's absolutely irrelevant. All of those people can be very good at sword fighting.
But one important thing I think to throw in there is, I mean, I've come up against opponents and I've witnessed and judged opponents in tournaments who clearly were trying their utmost to win, almost at all odds. And their interpretation of that was to hit as hard as possible, get as many doubles as possible.
Yeah.
Technique goes out of the window. They try and, essentially they become reckless and over. That's not what Mark means, because I know how Mark fights, and he might strike a bit harder, and he might not restrain himself, but he's not becoming vindictive or reckless in that sense. It's trying to win within the framework of the rules, like you said.
Absolutely.
But not to the degree of trying to injure someone so you can win and that kind of stuff, which wouldn't win in the rules that we use anyway.
No. And actually, one of my aims is, which I haven't succeeded in doing yet, is to win a HEMA tournament without being hit. And I think that's something to kind of strive for. I've not succeeded in it yet, but something to strive for, because that is going to mean that your timing, your distance, all those sort of things are going to be...
And a very, very interesting thing that I've just noticed, Mark constantly talks about being hit or not being hit. There are far too many people in HEMA who think 90% about hitting and not enough about not being hit. Okay, and one of the biggest problems I have when running tournaments and judging tournaments is people who are acting recklessly. And I don't mean recklessly in terms of safety. I mean they're not fighting like someone who cares about being hit.
Yeah.
And surely one of the fundamental, perhaps the most fundamental of all things to consider in armed martial arts is don't be hit.
Especially when you're talking metre-long, razor-sharp swords.
When any hit, you might be lucky, it might not do much to you, but any hit could potentially end your life. And one of the problems, as I see it, and I see it unfortunately in other tournaments, in HEMA tournaments that are uploaded to YouTube, is so many double hits, and so much attacking in the wrong tempo, and so much lack of care and lack of caution. And now that's not to say you should be crippled with caution and too scared to act, because as Vardy says, if you're scared of being hurt, then don't take up sword fighting. You have to be courageous, but it's being courageous and judicious at the same time, and using good judgment, as Fiore would say.
So coming back to your initial point and the questions you made, actually, if you're even half thinking about going into a tournament, give it a go. And actually, if you're going to fight camp, for example, I'm going to be there. I'd be absolutely delighted to speak to anybody beforehand that is thinking about going into a tournament and have a chat with them to start off with. And I'll positively encourage it and support that person. On a number of occasions, I've coached people, done some psychological coaching with them mid-tournament to help them kind of explore it. Go in, have a play, prototype it, see how you do, and have a chat with your instructor afterwards, and have a think about it.
And fight camp's a nice relaxing environment to try that in, especially since we've now got pool stages. So even your initial fights won't even have an audience. You'd just be fighting with someone, you keep score with each other, you report the score in, and it's tallied up. So it's pretty much one of the most low-key and relaxed environments where you can get a chance to do that. Right, final point, so the video doesn't go too long.
Yeah.
I think we've covered some absolutely golden stuff there. You've talked mostly about the brain.
Yeah.
Mostly about psychology and managing your body. What about physical and technique? And preparing and making yourself better prepared for tournaments?
Okay, so in terms of what kind of technique and what kind of martial principles are most useful, it fits into not being hit. Actually, distance, and I keep saying that because I would say probably the majority of HEMA fighters that I have fought anyway, at fight camp and outside fight camp, are poorly managing their distance. And you get your distance right and you're going to be hit less. You get your footwork right and you can get in and strike and displace without being hit. So many people start way too close to a new unknown opponent.
Yeah.
The distance, in my opinion, that people should be starting away from their opponent is way out of distance. I mean, actually, you can take it to another extent. If you know that you're going to be fighting someone in a tournament, then watch them before the tournament. Because really, you want to be gaining as much information as is useful to you so that you can work out some sort of plan that increases your chance of defeating that opponent.
The internet helps with this, of course, because
Absolutely.
if you're going to an event in 3 months' time and you know which other people are going to that event and are likely to be competing, you can probably find videos of them fighting on the internet and you can watch them and see how they fight.
So this analysis, which I've talked about before, that distance isn't, you're almost in combat distance before you've even met that person. You're gaining information, you're gaining a head start on them, so that when you get into that situation, you have more chance of using the right technique to defeat that opponent. So in terms of physicality, I suppose HEMA, in terms of the tournament scene, is developing, and some people are getting very, very serious about it. But actually, keep yourself really well hydrated. Eat sensibly beforehand. Fight camp, the tournaments are an element of it, but there's a whole range of things going on, like the socialising, which is great fun and really lovely lessons there as well. But what a lot of people tend to do is stay up late and drink lots of alcohol. Now, if you don't get proper sleep and if you drink lots of alcohol, surprisingly enough, that means that your performance is going to be worse than it would be otherwise. Now, I don't want to give away my secrets, but normally I will be in bed by 11, and normally I will get up, hydrate myself, and eat a bowl of cereal and bananas on the day of a tournament. So I'm getting the basics right, actually. If something's more professional, you can do all sorts of other stuff like ice baths and have a nutritionalist and all sorts of other stuff. I'm not necessarily suggesting we should be that serious necessarily in HEMA, but do those.
Unless people start throwing the big money at us, and then we'll take it seriously.
But do those basic things. If you're really serious about competing and maybe winning in a tournament, get yourself properly hydrated, eat properly, and get some advice from an experienced tournament fighter.
Right, we're going to wrap it up there because it's been a fairly long video again, but I think there's some absolutely sterling information in there to digest. For the record, asked the same question myself, I would have thought of different things. That's not to say I at all disagree. I basically agree with everything Mark said. But it's interesting how different people who compete, their first things that they think about are different things, and I will almost certainly do a video in the future talking about the things which immediately come to my mind in application to competition. Not saying that I'm like a top level competitor, but I've done okay in some competitions and I've got some bits of advice I would give to my students. So I'm sure I'll talk about that in the future as well. But thank you again to Mark.
That's a pleasure.
Cheers, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.